makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
So earlier today, I made a video on the scandal involving Ilhan Omar's statements over a supposed false equivalence between war crimes committed by the US and Israel and those committed by Hamas and the Taliban. And I have another video to show related to that incident. And I didn't want to include it in the previous video because for search engine optimization reasons. But this one really is just goes to show the incredible amount of ignorance that a lot of Americans, especially American conservatives, have about history, like basic historical facts, and why there's this tendency to whitewash all the bad things that the US does. And so the context of this video is a show called Rising by The Hill, which used to be hosted by Krystal and Saagar and Enjeti. And they were the basic purpose of this show was to put a left-wing populist like Krystal and a right-wing populist like Saagar and Enjeti, and have them on the same table and discuss issues that the mainstream media really wasn't willing to discuss, especially issues of like plutocracy, economic elites, things like that. And the show, like, I genuinely like the show in general. I think it added value in the sense that this was not the type of conversation that you were used to if you just spent your life watching MSNBC, CNN, or reading the New York Times. I obviously have very strongly opposing views to those of Saagar. He is basically a Tucker Carlsonite right-wing populist, and I think he disguises a lot of, very vile views under this guise of, oh, we also care about the poor, the workers and the poor. And I think that was the main problem with the show, that when you had them agree on so many things, it would almost make it seem that Trumpistas and Bernie bros were really into the same things, like agreed on more than that they disagreed in. And you really have to focus on, what the end game is, like what kind of society each side wants to build, to realize that there is very little commonality between a right-wing populist and a left-wing populist. Anyway, I say this because a couple of weeks ago, Krystal and Saagar left the show to start their own independently funded show, pretty much repeating what they were doing, and that's good. The less that these views are pushed towards an audience while under a corporate payroll, the better. But it seems that the producers of Rising still needed to kind of fill the gap with other people, so they chose. I don't know if they're now like the permanent hosts of this show or they're just doing it on a temporary basis until they find new people to fill in the slot, assuming the show will survive. But they put Ryan Grimm, who is a very good journalist. I really like his work. He writes for the Intercept. I think he's their DC bureau chief, and he appears quite often on a lot of left wing. When I say left wing, I mean like proper progressive shows, podcasts, etc. He does really good work. I insist. I think he's one of the best journalists out there. And his co-host on the right is Emily Jashinsky, and I want to give you a bit of a history of who she is. So she made her name with the Young Americas Foundation, which is a really, really right-wing group. They're basically just like a culture warrior obsessed, sort of like PragerU and Turning Points USA, like that type. Basically, all they complain about is stuff like Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, and yeah, they're awful. And she also worked for the Federalist, which is a very well-known conservative publication. Organization. So, Ryan Grimm and Emily Jashinsky now describe this incident with Ilhan Omar, and this is so cringe, like so cringe. Trigger warning if you're easily triggered by cringe. So, but it's really hilarious, and it really goes to show just like the level of historical knowledge that a lot of right wingers in the U.S. have. So, here we go.
Representative Ilhan Omar is receiving backlash from both sides of the aisle for recent comments in which she grouped the U.S. and Israel with terrorist groups. Let's throw her tweet up on the screen. You can see it right there. The Congresswoman said, "We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity. We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban." Ryan, I think that was misstated. I wonder if she would actually take it back. She has since defended it, but I wonder if she would say that maybe differently if she could. What do you think? Do you think she actually intended to have that sort of equivalence? And would you defend the equivalence if you were her?
Yes, of course. I mean, the right.
Just look, what the hell with like the demented laugh? Like, was she expecting him to agree? I mean, obviously, he's there because he's, from the left, which assumingly he would agree with what Ilhan Omar said.
On this wants to have it both ways. They want to go around when they can trigger the left and say all lives matter. But then when it comes to victims of U.S. imperialism, of whom there are probably tens of millions in the second half of the 20th century, all of a sudden lives are different. Some lives matter. If you were taken by an enemy, if you're a life that was taken by an enemy of the United States, if you fell at the hands of communists or terrorists, then your life mattered. If you are an Indonesian member of the Communist Party there and you're one of the 500,000 to 1 million people annihilated in that genocide, that U.S.-backed genocide, then your life doesn't matter. I don't understand. Maybe you can help explain it to me how it is anti-Semitic to talk about American history in an accurate way.
Well, I don't think this comment is particularly anti-Semitic
they're coming after her. Like
I'm not.
According to John Bresnahan with Punchbowl,
even Democrats.
Jewish Democrats in the House, he reported, are putting together or working on a statement calling her anti-Semitic for making this argument.
I mean, I think her All About the Benjamins tweet is still the clearest example that there may be anti-Semitism lurking in her worldview. But I would also say, in this case, when you include the United States with Israel in the equivalence between the Taliban and Hamas, I think it's clearly not targeted in the way that a charge of anti-Semitism would say. I do think it's extremely offensive to the establishment. I agree in this case because I think the Taliban and Hamas are forces for evil, and where you say the United States has also been a force of evil, that there are victims of United States imperialism, I think what that does is wash over people that the United States has saved through its actions. There is two sides to that, right? There are, I can admit, absolutely, of course, there are victims.
So I don't know if you remember, but there was a very controversial comment by Bernie Sanders during the campaign where he said that the Cuban regime, the Fidel Castro's regime, was very horrible. They committed, a lot of abuses and human rights violations. But, you got to recognize that they also got a lot of people out of poverty, gave education, healthcare, etc. And he was absolutely annihilated by those comments, despite the fact that, A, they were factually accurate, and B, the only issue really with that comment is that he said something positive about an enemy of the U.S., which is a huge no-no. So you're not supposed to say good things about the enemies of the U.S., and you're not supposed to say bad things about what the U.S. does. So this is clear what the language is.
But try to say the same thing and say, well, Hamas builds hospitals and schools, and the
Taliban
and the Taliban eradicated a lot of corruption around Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union raised living standards throughout. So if we're going to do this thing, well, okay, yes, it's true that U.S. imperialism killed tens of millions of people, but they also did good things. Then why does that only apply to the U.S. and not to all of these other countries, the evil empire?
Because the level of good, I think, that the United States has had around the world is wildly out. The balance there between good and bad is...
Emily, please come to Latin America. Read a book about Latin American history, and I dare you to say that the U.S.'s influence in Latin America has been more positive than negative. I mean, it's been overwhelmingly negative in almost every respect. And whenever you have this discussion with right-wingers, because I've had it so many times, they're always like, well, but the U.S. gives aid. You can add all the aid you want and then subtract like the huge amount of money that's been extracted from Latin America, money, resources, etc. To say nothing of the opportunity cost of all the money that could have been used in the benefit of Latin American people, especially the poor and workers, who that's been siphoned off, through foreign investment of U.S. multinationals, etc. So, this argument is based on so much ignorance.
Nowhere where it is compared to the Taliban.
You would have a hard time making that case in most countries where the U.S. intervened.
Right. No, I understand that completely, but that doesn't change my viewpoint, and I don't think it changes the facts that the balance of good and bad worldwide over the course of the United States' existence, it's silly to whitewash the bad. It's absolutely silly to whitewash bad. There has been plenty of it. But on the other side, on the balance, I think the United States has done incredible good around the world, continues to do incredible good around the world in a way that could never and should never be compared with the Taliban or Hamas.
It's funny that she doesn't even give an example of this good.
I would agree in this sense that when it comes to the amount of pain and suffering that the U.S. has produced around the world, the Taliban, Hamas, and Israel are pikers compared to what the U.S. has been able to accomplish just in, say, Argentina or just in...
That's the laugh of, like, incredulous ignorance. The fact that someone's making that statement so brazenly in her face, when she kind of knows that she won't find a way of replying to it, it's really like a combination of an incredulous laugh, but also a nervous laugh. And this is the point that he's making is very true. Like, the Taliban has done. I'm no fan in any way of the Taliban. I think they're absolutely horrible. I wish they would disappear on the face of the earth. They have done incalculable evil in Afghanistan. But the U.S. has done a shitload of evil in a shitload of places. If you add that up, if you add the evil, clearly the U.S. is it's not even close. It's absolutely not even close.
Indonesia, or just in Vietnam, or just in Congo, or just you could throw a dart anywhere at the global map, and you can probably find, at some point throughout the 20th century, the U.S. intervening to undermine, some type of social democratic effort and backing the most vicious right-wing elements. And the irony of them calling this anti-Semitism when the U.S. very consciously and explicitly, out of World War II, allied itself with former Nazis, helped Nazis escape justice, was complicit in what was called the rat line, with getting Nazis out of Germany.
This is true, by the way. Even the New York Times admits it. Read up on the rat lines. This is not a conspiracy theory. This actually happened.
And into these death squads that were run by the United States and deployed in an anti-communist fashion against the Soviet Union and against leftist elements in South America.
But who ended the Holocaust? I mean, what country?
The Soviet Union.
Oh my God, that was so... she basically has no answer to the first point about the rat line. So she's like, well, who the Holocaust, who and she's so stupid to not realize who actually contributed the most to the defeat of Nazi Germany.
actually.
Okay, but
I mean, the Soviet Union did that.
no,
We
the Soviet
walked
Union,
in after the Russians had suffered 20+ million casualties and marched into Germany.
Sure, but without the United States' intervention, a heck of a lot more people would have died in that atrocity.
Yes,
So-
I'm glad the Soviet Union and the United States allied to.
So that is factually false, because most of the victims of the Holocaust came from Eastern Europe, not Western Europe. So the fact that the Soviet Union was, the Red Army was the one that liberated almost the entirety of Eastern Europe means that all the people that would have ended up going to the camps would have come from the East. So it is technically correct. It's not true that the Soviet Union liberated all the camps. I mean, there were a lot of camps in the West, some of the worst ones, like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. They were liberated by the Western Allies. There's a famous picture of Eisenhower going into one of the camps. Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army. But the fact is that, if you hadn't defeated Nazi Germany, which, if you look at the numbers of how many Germans died in the East versus the West, basically, at the point of D-Day, which was when the bulk of the Western Allies finally landed in the continent, up until that point, something like the ratio of German war dead in the East and West was like 9-1. So for every German dead in the West, 9 of them were killed in the East. And by the end of the war, it went down to like 5-1. So basically, 80% of the German army was killed fighting the Soviet Union. So yeah, that is pretty overwhelming. This is no serious historian disputes this. But Americans are so ignorant about history, especially right-wing. They want to insist that they single-handedly won World War II, just like they often lie that they won World War I, despite the fact that they only fought one major battle in World War I, at the very end, when the Germans had already been pretty much defeated. That's how Americans delude themselves, that everything good that's happened in the world has been because of them. And it's just, the level of ignorance right here is insane.
Beat Nazi Germany. But the Nazi Germany, the Nazis themselves then allied with the United States to go after the Soviet Union and to go after communist and social democratic elements in South America. That's an actual part of the history.
Right, but again, there's lives being saved in that process, a lot of lives being saved in that process, and a lot of Americans putting their lives on the line and dying to save those lives.
Sure, but many fewer than Soviet lives died to take on the Nazis.
But that doesn't change the fact that the United States intervened and risked lots and lots of lives compared to what it may have been complicit in, or what it may have been lives it may have costed on the other side of that. I think, again, the balance there is clearly on the side of good in a way that you can't apply to the Taliban or Hamas. I would much rather have I would take the establishment government of the United States over the governing forces and the establishment of the Taliban.
That's such an idiotic comparison. No one's saying that you would rather live under the Taliban than the US. It's just the fact that the US, as a global power, has influenced over so many other countries that it's been able to do a lot of bad in those countries, despite being in itself, for its own people, better than some of the other despicable regimes like the Taliban. So no one's disputing that. No one's saying that the Taliban treats Afghanis better than the US treats Americans. It's just that Americans overseas will do a lot of damage to non-Americans.
Any day. I'm glad we're in the American empire, not the Taliban empire.
Wait till you hear who funded the Taliban at the very beginning.
Well, there is that. That's not a bad point, Ryan. Ryan says he thinks the Congresswoman was giving an overly generous view of U.S. history. Here's his tweet. This is basically what we just discussed.
Yeah, and I mean, this is maybe it's not that right exactly. So my point there is that. If you actually tallied up the body count, and if you said all lives matter, that the U.S. death count is orders of magnitude higher than the other 3 countries that she lumped them with. So in that sense, I would say it's unfair to those other countries.
Which is exactly what we just worked through in terms of tallying things up.
All right, Emily, tomorrow on Rising.
Jesus Christ, what an idiot. Like, what an absolute idiot. And, you know, you can tell that she just didn't have any arguments. You know, hence the laughter when she thought she was hearing something outrageous. And the fact that she just kept on switching to a different point. So there you have it. That's the American conservative history lesson of the day. I mean, I enjoyed that segment because she got utterly schooled on live television. And it's a shame that this doesn't happen more often. It's a shame that this doesn't happen in the more mainstream channels. Like when some you hear these same arguments, you know, just because she's a right winger, like a very staunch right winger, as I showed, her views are still broadly the accepted views even among like liberal centrists in the U.S. Like, this is still the line that you see pursued in channels like MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post. So this is not an oddity. This is not unique to the American right. It is the established narrative that all the bad things that the U.S. does in the world need to be whitewashed, as with the actions of U.S. allies like Israel. Those always need to be whitewashed. You always must, if you are so daring as to say that, or to admit that something that the US or Israel or Britain does in the world, you must immediately put it into context of all the other good things that they did. Whereas you can't do the same with an enemy of the US. You must always focus on all the bad things that they do. And that's Cold War mentality, basically. That's just, you know, there is it's this very idiotic view of the world that I've always gotten a sense from Americans, and as someone who studied in the U.S. As a kid, who was there for elementary school and high school, and I would see what was written in the textbooks. It was very much a whitewashing of anything. Any contribution of the U.S. in anything bad in the world. It was, and you see this reflected in pop culture. You know, this good versus evil. There's always a good guy. There's always a villain. There's very few shades of gray. That is changing, thankfully. You know, one of the things I liked about Game of Thrones is that the characters were much more gray from a moral perspective than you saw in kind of traditional fantasy or sci-fi. So I think there is growing need to question these dogmas. But definitely it's the left that's making this effort. It's not the right in any way, as you saw here. So yeah, that was pretty funny. And yeah, if you like this video, like, share, subscribe, and thanks for watching.